Three sailors, one bed, and they call it hot bunking because by the time you crawl in, it's still warm from the guy who just left. That's not a rumor or a wartime story. There aren't enough bunks for everyone on board, so sailors rotate in and out of the same bunk. One sleeps while the other is on duty, and they swap when the shift changes. And that's just one of the things happening inside a submarine right now, somewhere beneath the surface of the ocean that most people have never thought about. This video is about what actually happens inside a submarine the moment it dives, the mechanics, the sounds, the physical experience, and the hidden world the crew lives in for weeks at a time. Most people know submarines go underwater. Almost nobody knows what that actually looks and feels and sounds like from the inside. And there's one fact near the end of this, about what actually limits how long a submarine can stay submerged. That's going to completely change the way you think about these machines. Let's start with the dive itself, because the way it works is way simpler and way weirder than you'd expect. A submarine floats on the surface the same way any ship does, because it's buoyant. The trick is a system of large tanks built into the hull called ballast tanks. When the sub is on the surface, those tanks are full of air, which keeps the whole vessel light enough to float. The moment the crew decides to dive, vents open at the top of those tanks and seawater floods in while the air pushes out. The sub gets heavier, loses its buoyancy, and starts to sink. To come back up, compressed air gets blasted back into the tanks, forces the water out, and the sub rises again. That's the whole mechanism. Air in, you float. Water in, you sink. But here's where it gets more interesting. Ballast tanks are really just for getting under the surface. Once the sub is submerged, depth control works differently. There are smaller tanks called trim tanks that fine-tune the buoyancy so the sub sits perfectly neutral. Not rising, not sinking, just hovering. Water gets pumped between the forward and aft trim tanks to balance the angle of the boat, similar to shifting weight around in a canoe to keep it level. And then there are dive planes, angled control surfaces on the hull, front and back, that work almost exactly like the elevators on an airplane. When the sub is moving forward, those planes physically steer it deeper or shallower. That's actually the primary way a submarine changes depth while it's underway. Not by flooding more tanks, but by tilting into the water like a plane tilting through the sky. Now here's what that dive actually feels like from inside the hull. Because there's a whole physical and sensory experience that happens the moment it starts. Before anything else, there's the alarm. A distinctive klaxon, the classic dive, 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 signals the crew to secure every hatch and take their stations. Then the vents open, the water starts flooding in, and the sub begins its descent. The first thing that changes is the sound. On the surface, you hear the constant noise of waves, wind, water moving against the hull. The moment you go under, all of that disappears. It goes quiet in a way that takes some getting used to. And then, as the sub goes deeper and the pressure outside the hull increases, the steel itself starts to respond. The hull compresses slightly and makes groaning, creaking, popping sounds. The crew learns to tell the difference between normal sounds, what they call the boat working, and something that actually needs attention. Sonar technicians are specifically trained to notice acoustic changes because their ears and their instruments are the sub's only real window to the outside world. And speaking of the outside world, once that hatch seals and the sub goes under, the crew's connection to everything above the surface basically disappears. Anytime the submarine sends a signal, it identifies its position and loses the secrecy that is at the core of the crew's mission. So communication home gets severely limited for weeks at a time. No windows, no sunlight, no way to tell morning from night except by looking at a clock. Life revolves around an 18-hour day, split into 6-hour shifts, 6 hours on, 12 hours off, which allows for watch rotations, training, maintenance, and sleep. Many navies now use tunable lighting systems that simulate sunrise and sunset artificially, just to keep the crew's sleep cycles from drifting completely out of sync. And sleep brings us back to that hot bunking situation, because it's even more extreme than it sounds. On Virginia-class submarines, there are fewer beds than sailors, about 94 bunks for a crew of 135, which requires what crews call hot racking, where sailors share bunks and sleep in shifts. Generally, the lowest-ranking members of the crew are the ones required to hot rack. You climb into a bunk with a thin curtain for privacy and a small locker for all your personal belongings. And the only reason you know someone else just vacated it is because it's still warm. The torpedo room doubles as an exercise room and sometimes a bunk room. Every last inch is conserved and made ready for multiple uses. The officer's wardroom, where senior officers eat, doubles as an operating theater in medical emergencies. There is no wasted space. Every cubic foot is allocated between weapons, machinery, and the minimum amount of habitability the crew needs to function. Now here's the part that almost nobody thinks about, and this is the one I mentioned at the start that's going to reframe everything. How does anyone breathe down there for weeks at a time? The answer is that they make the air. Oxygen is produced by sending desalinated seawater through a water electrolyzer, which splits it into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen goes into the cabin air, and the hydrogen gets vented overboard. It's the same basic chemistry as a high school science experiment, scaled up and running continuously. Removing the carbon dioxide the crew exhales is just as crucial as generating oxygen. So submarines use specialized CO2 scrubbers to pull it out of the air before it builds up to dangerous levels. Fresh water gets produced through desalination of seawater as well. So on a nuclear submarine, the crew is essentially manufacturing the air they breathe and the water they drink from the ocean around them continuously for the entire patrol. Nuclear-powered submarines have a substantial advantage here because their onboard reactors generate ample electricity, which allows them to run electrolysis units and CO2 removal systems constantly for extended periods, which means theoretically a nuclear submarine could stay submerged almost indefinitely on power alone. So what actually forces them to surface? Food. The primary limitation for nuclear submarines' submerged endurance is the amount of food and other consumables they can carry, often allowing them to stay underwater for months, sometimes up to 120 days or more. The reactor runs. The air gets made. The water gets made. The only thing that cannot be manufactured on board is dinner. A vessel that can theoretically circle the globe without surfacing still has to come up eventually because somebody gets hungry. That's the irony buried inside one of the most advanced machines ever built. If you've made it this far and you're finding this as fascinating as I do, drop a comment below. I want to know what surprised you most. Was it the hot bunking? The fact that they make their own air? Or the food thing at the end? The algorithm loves engagement and it helps more people find videos like this. So your comment actually matters more than you think. And if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole, there's a video right next to this one that goes deep into how ships are designed to survive flooding. Same world, completely different angle, and it pairs perfectly with everything you just learned here. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next in this series. Here's what you now know that you didn't an hour ago. A submarine dives by flooding ballast tanks with seawater, then uses trim tanks and dive planes to hold its depth and steer while submerged. The moment it goes under, the surface noise vanishes. The hull starts groaning under pressure, and the crew enters a sealed world with no natural light, no outside contact, and no sense of time except what the schedule tells them. Hot racking, sharing bunks between shifts, is the norm on a submarine due to limited sleeping space. The crew breathes air that gets manufactured from the seawater around them, and the only thing standing between a nuclear submarine and an indefinite patrol is the fact that someone eventually runs out of food. These machines are extraordinary, and the people inside them are operating in conditions most of us will never come close to understanding, which is exactly why it's worth understanding.